Okay, for this video, this will be my philosophy of assessment um, video final. So, it said in the syllabus that I needed to cover the 7 questions on pages 4 and 5 of the Brophy text, the questions for shaping an assessment philosophy. So I'll have a series of 7 little clips here, one to answer each of the questions with a couple of additional comments at the end. Alright, for the first question, what is important for your students to know and be able to do? I think that's an important question that teachers need to answer, and I think it needs to be answered on the basis of each individual class and the needs of individual students. That's a big tenet of my, personal philosophy. So I think, you teach kids in the Trenton School District very differently than you would teach them in, for example, the Cherry Hill School District. The example I drew from Jonathan Cole's book, Shame of a Nation. It's just too different. It's not that one is, better than the other necessarily. I mean, one is disadvantaged, to be sure, which is another issue altogether. However, you can't assess or teach those two groups of students in the same way. So what is being taught has to be determined on an individual basis and can't be answered. It can't have a universal answer that applies to all situations. But I also think that the question of what students should be able to know is it's more the job of curriculum to decide that, I think. It's nice if teachers have some influence on the curriculum, if administrators are open enough to allow teachers to develop curriculum. But I know in some cases, especially for first year teachers, sometimes you won't have a choice in developing what is taught. How it is taught is up to the teacher. But what and why, I think, are sometimes more. You have to do more with curriculum. The second question is, how do you know what you want your students to know is important for their learning? Again, I think this ties in with the last question, and that it has to be answered on an individual basis with each group of students that a teacher encounters. And I think the main focus of this question is focusing on why you teach something to students, why you teach them something, and what and why kind of justify, each other. Because if there's no reason why you're teaching something to kids, there's no reason to teach them. So I would say why informs what you teach. But again, sometimes that responsibility doesn't fall to the teacher. When when teachers graduate and go out and get a job, you would hope that you would have that kind of influence on curriculum. I just don't know that it's realistic to assume that every teaching experience you would go into is going to allow you to have that kind of direct influence on curriculum, and therefore a direct influence on assessment. Because I think assessment can be informed by curriculum. I mean, again, kind of an unfortunate or occurrence, but I think to a large extent that can be true. Now, teachers can kind of bend and shape curriculum to try and meet the needs of their students, and their personal philosophies. But again, I'd say why informs how, informs what. But sometimes that's up to the teacher, but unfortunately sometimes it's not, and you just have to, I think, learning to work with and or around that issue is really important for teachers. This next question is probably the one on which I agree the most with what Brophy has to say in this book. It's how do you find out what your students know and are able to do? And Brophy says basically the best way to do that is to just watch and see what your students' capabilities are. And to a large extent I agree with that. And he also says that how much or how well a teacher is able to know their students is based on on time, how much time you have with your students every day, and the number of students you have. Both of which Brophy cites, and I think I agree wholeheartedly with those two sentiments. But I think determining the potential of your students is one of the most important things you can do in an assessment program or in teaching in general. I think it even goes beyond the bounds of just assessment, just in lesson planning and teaching. Knowing the potential, or as best as you can, knowing the potential of your students is one of the most important things that a teacher is required. That is required of a teacher. I think, and I think with regard to that, with regard to determining the potential of your students, I think overestimating the potential of your students is much better, I think, long term than underestimating their potential. If I were to give, for example, and in classes I've taken in the past, the first thing a teacher does is hand out an exam of some kind to find out how much students are able to do, and challenging them. I think one notable memory I have is when I went to a Westminster summer camp before I was admitted. I was applying for a theory course, and they had us take an exam, and it was very progressive. The further you went in the test, the more difficult the questions got. And I did eventually, I almost finished the whole test, but there was a point where I had to say, no, I don't know this. And I think that's a really good way to measure, how much your students can do, because if you just kind of set a flat, level and just like, well, if you can get to here, that's, it's like, oh, you already know everything, I suppose. But I think you really, it's more important to overestimate, because you can always bring down the level, but if you underestimate, you don't know how far they can go. So every time you kind of, it just seems like it would generate more work for a teacher if you underestimate the potential of your students. This next question is kind of an interesting one. It's, is teacher observation in class enough? I think this also has to do with determining student potential. And I mean, Brophy says it, and it seems like this question has kind of an obvious answer, which is no, teacher observation is not enough. It's never been enough. He says the advent of higher standards requires that a new set of assessment techniques be used. And I don't, when was that advent? It couldn't have been that long ago. I mean, I think, of course, there needs to be some kind of system in place for assessment. It's unfortunate, but administrations tend not to trust teachers. I mean, as on principle, without knowing teachers on an individual basis, they don't trust them. Teachers have to earn the trust of their administrations. In my experience, that's what I've observed. They have to earn trust, and so observation becomes more valuable as they gain the trust of their administration. But there needs to be some kind of record keeping, of course. And it is, I'm kind of confused because there doesn't seem to be much more to that question than that. Obviously you need to have some kind of system in place. I mean, that's what the whole book is about. Is about, here are the different ways you can come up with, to assess your students. These are the different techniques you may want to use. So, but again, which techniques you use is again dependent on the students and has to be answered and researched, and thought out on an individual basis. Each class, I think, has a different makeup and has to be, catered to